Finding wide receivers late in your fantasy football drafts is a big challenge in 2023, but Shawn Siegele is here to help you with some wide receiver options, 5 in particular, that are very, very deep and that could potentially be tournament winners. That's what we were talking about today on RotoViz Overtime. Shawn, it's always fun to dive into player lists. People love lists where it's, 5, 3, 10 off this, that, or the other. So we have 5 here that we're going to go through. We may give them all away on today's show. We may not, but we'll see what we do over the course of the next kind of 30 minutes or so. The one thing I want to mention at the start of today's episode, we are giving away a Scott Fish 13 entry, thanks to Mr. Scott Fish himself. This contest, though, is already ongoing. People may have seen it on my Twitter account at Overtime Ireland. If you're interested in getting involved, there will be a link in today's show notes. That will mean that if you want to enter in, head on over and do so. You may have already done some of the things, for example, leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. If you haven't done that already, even if you don't want to enter the contest, please take this opportunity to do so. But there is a couple of steps. The other one being that you can also click that subscribe button on rotoviz.com. Let us know over on the Twitter. Reply to that tweet if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer those. But one entry being given away. But that contest will close on Friday, so it's moving pretty quick. If you're listening to this on the Wednesday edition, make sure you get involved pretty swiftly. But Shawn, 5 late round wide receivers, and we did draft recently against the listeners. It's a challenge when you're in that last couple of rounds trying to find those names, particularly in a wide receiver heavy format. If you are over at Underdog, for example, trying to find those names. But 5 names you have. Do you want to jump into the 5 names? Do you want to talk some strategy about how to pick profiles of the wide receivers that you want to take in the late rounds? Which way do you want to look at it?
Colm, my favorite way to seek out some of these late round gems is to focus on players who have demonstrated some type of elite ability, and hopefully that has manifested itself in one or multiple years of production at a meaningful level. And for whatever reason, they're not being given credit for that, or the situation is such that they might have to fight through some adversity in order to get there from a volume perspective. One of the things that is interesting late in these drafts is that one of the things that's interesting late in these drafts is that the demand for receivers is so significant and the available names are so limited that you have a lot of players going off the board in this 9 through 13 range. So round 9 through round 13. And in this particular conversation, we're discussing the underdog names. A lot of these players have sort of established track records where they are good, not great, and also have volume issues. And so it's not that a player like that couldn't hit, but if you have a long enough track record for us to believe the evidence is pretty strongly pointing in the direction of being just a guy, and if you're just a guy at the NFL level, you're fantastic, right? So it's not a criticism of them as a player so much as an awareness of the fact that their ceiling is mostly limited. And then if the volume profile also isn't there, well, what are you going to do with that? Now, when I say the volume profile isn't there, usually these guys are either wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 on their teams, and drafters can see where some targets would come from. And so they're trying to draft targets in that range. We would prefer to avoid the round 9 through 13 range in general. There are a couple of names there that are interesting, but almost always we're going to avoid that range. We're going to select other positions. We're going to let these guys fall. And in many cases, when you're talking about round 9, I mean, those first 8 rounds, Colm, you want to have at least 5, if not 6 wide receivers already. And so when we're talking about the late rounds, it's not a matter of drafting a bunch of these guys together. It's about finding an interesting profile that could supplement what you've already done. And in a perfect world, that player breaks out and scores a lot of points for you. But in a more realistic scenario, you're looking for someone who could evolve and emerge as the season goes along, could be a focal point of the offense or a meaningful big play threat, big game threat, a spike week player for the fantasy playoffs. And we're trying to find guys who may be a little bit buried, but if they were to get the opportunity and if they were to develop at the rate that is reasonable for what their profile has been in the past, then they could be something pretty special down the stretch when you really need them.
So we're going to get into the first name on the list now, Shawn. It's in round 14, so we're starting to get pretty deep at this stage. The one thing I will highlight, Shawn, round 16, pretty bleak for trying to find those wide receivers. None is the option if you're in round 16. But in round 14, we have Marvin Mims. He's going as the wide receiver 74 at this particular moment in time, drafted to the Denver Broncos, somebody that we talked quite a bit about in that draft process. Interesting dynamics for him as a rookie, landing into a place where obviously you have Jerry Jeudy, you have Cortland Sutton, you have Greg Dulcich. There's a lot of moving pieces in this. You have, is there a resurgence coming for Russell Wilson? You also have the scenario of the new head coach coming in and Sean Payton. So there's lots of moving parts here. But Mims seems like somebody who, with a couple of things not even having to go his way, and it's particularly at around 14 ADP, that can really return on value here in 2023.
Yeah, just to give a little bit of context, when we're talking about these rookie receivers, these guys who we're looking at them still mostly as prospects, the main players from the last handful of years, when you're talking about on a per route basis, and we're specifically using the Sports Info Solutions charting numbers, you can get that throughout our draft content. Obviously, you have the Advanced Stat Explorer, you have the Advanced Team Stat Explorer, who deliver SIS NFL data to you throughout the regular NFL season. When we're looking at that for context, we're kind of looking at guys who are going to be delivering from, say, 3 to like 3.6 yards per route as being the prospects who are probably going to go in that 15 to 30-ish range in the first round. Now, you need to have the youth with that. You need to have some other traits that people like, but that's context. Mims was at 4.6 as a freshman. Now, partly that happens because you don't have a full route load. And so when you're actually out there, sometimes you're a little bit more of a target than somebody who's running routes on every play. But he is dynamic right from the jump as a college player, not something that we necessarily see from all of the other prospects. He backs that up with 2 seasons over 3. He's got a 4.38 40, a 90th percentile explosion. He's one of the youngest players in this draft. And Colm, when we had Scott Barrett on the show, he was even more aggressive than the other folks. Everybody loved him. Patrick Carrain loved him. Travis was having a hard time understanding kind of where he was going. Matt Hicks liked him. Scott said he's probably the second best prospect in this draft at the receiver position. My take on it was not that dissimilar. I at least thought that he deserved to be in the conversation with Quentin Johnston and Jordan Addison. We know those guys were drafted earlier and they're selected much earlier in fantasy drafts. Johnston's someone we're taking a lot with Justin Herbert. Addison is in that situation where it seems like he's going to have a lot of routes early, and yet his price is just, it's tough, right? It's tough. So I don't have a lot of exposure to him at this point, have a lot of exposure in Dynasty because he's one of the targets we're loading up on. But Mims an interesting guy because he went earlier than I think a lot of people expected, and yet you could have seen him go earlier still. If he had gone to the Panthers instead of Jonathan Mingo, then, he would be the it player in all of these fantasy drafts. If he had gone to the Chiefs instead of Rashee Rice, he would be, he'd be going around where Zay Flowers is at wide receiver 46 at the very worst. Unfortunately, he goes to Denver. They have a lot of receivers. They have Russell Wilson. I still like this play because he's the guy that the new coaching staff has made a statement about. All offseason, you heard all of their receivers are available in trade. It's probably not really the case. If they had gotten a huge offer for Jerry Jeudy, that may have interested them, even though Jeudy is the clear other guy here. I don't think that there could realistically have been any interest in Cortland Sutton, and Tim Patrick, and KJ Hamler. But my case for Mims is that if it falls in the right direction, you can get scoring from him late. Sean Payton loves him. George Patton was talking about how much better he was in his final season. And yet really the last 2 seasons were pretty similar again from a per route perspective, but they raving about the way he tracks the ball, his hands, his toughness, his transition off the catch on screens. They love his toughness for the size, right? And so he's a small guy, and there were a lot of small players in this draft. And I think that because he got open on a bunch of vertical routes in college and was very dynamic, not just from a per route perspective, but from a per reception perspective, you kind of think of him as being pigeonholed into this niche vertical type of role. That's not the way that they see him. That's not the way the talent would suggest that he can be used either. And so I think that he's probably the wide receiver 2 on this team when you're talking about the final month of the year. But I also think you're going to have some shot plays throughout the season where he gets involved. The tricky thing with Mims, and the reason that he's not more expensive, even though a lot of people obviously like him, he's going at wide receiver 74. It's just, where do you find the true overall volume that you need to make the play here? This is a bet on talent in the midst of chaos. All you have to do is look at this depth chart and the last several years, and it's very easy to see how people don't necessarily stay healthy. If that happens this season, Mims could have a big campaign.
The next name on the list, Shawn, and this is a bit like Mims, but a name who, when you look into the metrics and using the RotoViz tool, seeing how he has done over the last couple of seasons, we have Curtis Samuel at wide receiver 76 in the 15th round. And over the last 4 seasons, 32 of the games that he has been available and active in, he has been a wide receiver 2 or better. He's been a wide receiver 1 in 15% of those games, and some very impressive numbers. Never really truly, getting into that upper 20 points per game range, but quite a few around the, between 18 and 22 points per game in that time. Somebody who has been very effective. He's in an offense now, though, obviously with Sam Howell potentially as the quarterback. He has Terry McLaurin as his wide receiver 1A or 1B, depending on which way people are looking at it, along with Jahan Dodson. He is somebody who has obviously followed his head coach in Ron Rivera over from Carolina as well. So there's a connection there. He has spent quite a bit of time, though, in that spell that I mentioned over the last kind of 4 seasons or so where he has been inactive. That was the season before last. Do you still think that there's a lot of ways where he could be? And I guess here we're looking at the price as well, but he is somebody who has shown those flashes in the past, and it's potentially still there for him.
Yeah, this is going to be a bet on the Washington Commanders, and it's a bet on Sam Howell. And one of the things that we want to think about here is that if we're betting on Sam Howell anyway, at least on specific teams. Not every team is obviously going to have him. You want to keep a decent chunk separate from that in case the worst case scenario of a benching or whatnot happens. But when you're looking at what this offense would be like if Howell has a good season, it probably includes someone like a Curtis Samuel, who is extremely athletic, who is very dynamic with the ball in his hands. And he's played 6 seasons in the NFL, Colm. Most of them haven't been fantastic. And yet he's just going to turn 27 this August, right? So that's the value of coming into the league very young. He's still a peak age type of player. And you think about a guy who is electric with the ball and how that fits into the offense that the new offensive coordinator, Eric Bieniemy, is bringing over from Kansas City. You think about names like McCole Hardman. You look at how they used Kadarius Toney last year. You think about some of those touchdowns that they scored in the Super Bowl.
And he is somebody that really does fit that mold.
Oh, it's absolutely perfect. It's absolutely perfect. So a lot of it is going to depend on if the new offense works and if Sam Howell can play. Because if those 2 things don't happen, and there's bound to be some sort of adjustment, I think Howell is going to look really good. You hear huge compliments from his teammates all the time, and yet you can look good in practice. You can be a future NFL starter and not take off in your first opportunity. Trevor Lawrence, considered to be one of the greatest prospects of all time, took about 1.5 years to get going. If the Commanders overreact to whatever happens in that first month, and Ron Rivera feels like he needs to make a change because his job is in jeopardy, you could lose all of this. And I mean, I don't have a lot of interest in Curtis Samuel with Jacoby Brissett as quarterback, even if Brissett is actually one of the best 32 quarterbacks in the NFL, and almost certainly he is. But if you get that offense starting to mature if they look good in the preseason, you want to really keep an eye on this. I mean, if that happens, Samuel's price is going to rise. But Terry McLaurin is a tough guy to draft. You get past him and you're trying to think of how can I build this cool Howell team? Well, you want to get one of those receivers from the 49ers and then Dotson and Samuel together if possible. Colm, the other risk there is if it doesn't come together, we did see that Dotson took a chunk out of Samuel's opportunity in the second half of the season. Samuel played 81% of the snaps in the first 9 weeks, only 62% thereafter. On a per route basis, his targets also declined. And so you have to look at those two guys ahead of him as being a threat. But when we're talking about wide receiver 76 and drafting for scenarios, I like this particular player in this campaign for certain builds.
Moving on, Shawn, we're going to pair two players together here that are in two explosive offenses. You can elaborate on both of them, either of them, whichever way you do choose here. And I mentioned around 16, there's no names there, so it's going to be tricky for drafters looking for wide receivers in this range. But we do have Khalil Shakir, wide receiver 83, somebody obviously with Buffalo, high-powered offense. Some challengers for him in terms of targets. There's quite a few, but you have Diggs, Davis, McKenzie, and then Shakir at wide receiver. You also have the tight ends and Dalton Kincaid to factor in. So there's a lot of competition for targets, I guess, in Buffalo, but you also have access to those targets from Josh Allen. On that roster, Justyn Ross is the other name in round 19, wide receiver, or in round 18, wide receiver 91. He is somebody, Shawn, who obviously coming in last year to the draft, we know about the injuries. We know about how maybe the way things finished out in college with those injury concerns wasn't what people would have obviously hoped for. He had the foot injury, he had the neck issue. But now, obviously, a year removed from missing last season on injured reserve for the Chiefs, he is now in the mix to be there. Obviously, we've talked about Rashee Rice. We've talked about Sky Moore. We actually talked on a recent draft show about, not a huge amount of wide receiver competition if somebody can step up to the plate. So Tony, who you mentioned a moment ago, but at the moment it is no clear wide receiver 1, 2, or 3 really, it feels like, on that roster. But Justyn Ross has all the talent in the world, but has had all the injury issues in the world as well. I guess we could say those two names, people should be drafting them, but how excited should they be for potential breakouts this season?
Well, we'll leave the Ross enthusiasm for another day. And I've linked some of the historical Stealing Bananas podcasts into the article there. If people want to get some really enthusiastic notes on him. We don't have a sense of what he is going to be and how healthy he's going to be. It seems like even for OTAs, not full health, they do have a lot of bodies there as well. Someone like Richie James was very good down the stretch last season. And so you'd have to be something to make it in Kansas City, even though the wide receiver 1 role is there. Shakir is interesting, right? He's a guy who his last couple of seasons at Boise State, you have 3.25 yards per team attempt in 2020. You have 2.7 in 2021. Both of those are good numbers. He's got a dominator rating of 46% in the junior year, 35% in the senior season. He goes over 100 rushing yards in both of those. He falls pretty deep into the draft. He is a good, not great athlete, but Shakir is basically Jaden Reed, who is on a team where they need receivers and is on a team where they score a ton of points. And I think that Reed could end up being something with the Packers. It's not to completely fade him there, but when you look at the prices for these different guys and you look at where they are sort of in their trajectory and how much experience they're going to have, Shakir was really coming on down the stretch and looked good in last year's playoffs. We know that the Bills are not completely sold on what they have, which is both a strike against Shakir, but it's also something where if they are still looking for a player like a DeAndre Hopkins, and when you're talking about the Bills and you're talking about the Chiefs, in both of those cases, if they could get him at a reasonable price, you would do that, if for no other reason to keep him away from other teams. But the Bills have Stephon Diggs, and then they have a lot of questions, and they even have questions with Stephon Diggs. So, I mean, you can see in the enthusiasm for Dalton Kincaid, and Dalton Kincaid may be awesome, right? You do have guys come in, even at the tight end position. And I always think back to Aaron Hernandez. We think about it purely from a football perspective, leave all the other stuff out, and what he did as a rookie. I mean, you see examples of these guys coming in and being very dynamic forces. And yet the fact that there's so much enthusiasm there gives you a little bit of a sense of where the volume really could be in this Bills offense. If you're not on Gabe Davis, and Davis had some kind of nagging injuries last year, he's always a threat to have a big game, but I would prefer to take Shakir in this range at wide receiver 83, where you're drafting him against players who are more or less meaningless, as opposed to having to draft Davis at his price, even though his price is a discount to where he was going the previous season.
The final name, Shawn, to talk about is when we talk about where they're being drafted. He has currently been undrafted as the wide receiver 104. It is Tutu Atwell. We did discuss this on some of our recent draft coverage as being a potential late round target. Hit me with the pitch for Tutu Atwell here in the, not even the very, very late rounds after the draft, if you're able to, best ball drafts aren't going to have those waivers, but somebody who is basically free at this point.
Yeah, so we think about Tutu, and in the research that I was doing on Jackson Smith and Jigba and Elijah Moore, two guys we really like, the stat that would keep popping up that was so extraordinary was that in that season, the 2021 year before his 2022 was ruined by injuries and or maybe the kind of the soft sitting out to keep himself for the NFL, JSN is competing against Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave for targets and still averages 4.4 yards per route. And we know that some of that is that you don't run every route when you've got Wilson and Olave also out there. But some of it is that when those guys weren't there, he goes off for one of the all-time great games in the bowl against Utah. He averages 123 yards per game. We're thinking JSN is going to go in the top 10 picks. He falls a little bit in this draft. He goes to a situation with the Seahawks that maybe isn't perfect. But if we're talking 2 years from now about JSN being the number 3 wide receiver in football and someone who should have gone as the 101 in this year's dynasty draft. Now, we're not saying that that's where we were taking him necessarily either, although we were taking him at the 102 and 103 a lot. I don't think people will be surprised by that. The numbers are there. You look at some other guys in that range. CeeDee Lamb, his best season, 4.4. T. Higgins, somebody who just didn't run a ton of routes at Clemson because they were so loaded. But the freshman season for Justyn Ross versus the sophomore season for T. Higgins was also part of the Ross conversation that we didn't go into today. Devontae Smith, not the senior year where he went absolutely crazy and won the Heisman, but the junior year where he's competing with guys like Jerry Jeudy and Jalen Waddle. Devontae Smith, 4.1. So I'm looking at guys who, as underclass receivers, went over 4 and put up big overall numbers, right? You got to average a lot of yards per game as well. Those are the names. That's an amazing group. Colm, the name that jumped out ahead of them was Tutu Atwell, who went for 4.5, 98 yards per game. He goes with the 57th pick of the 2020 draft, and that's pretty heavily criticized because Tutu is 155 pounds, which, that just doesn't really play at the NFL level, right? But you look at that season, and I say, well, he's averaged 4.5 yards per route, 18.2 yards per reception, scored 12 touchdowns, 4.2 yards per team attempt, and so that portion of it is actually blowing away those other names on that list. 40% dominator rating. And you're like, well, you can see why the Rams went ahead and picked him. The guys after him, a whole bunch of busts, and then Amon-Ra. Everybody doesn't say just draft Amon-Ra, but if people had been on that, they would have done it. You go back to his rookie season, doesn't do much. He's injured a lot. You look to 2022, where they had this opportunity late in the year with Cooper Kupp out. The offense isn't really doing anything. And he doesn't have nearly as many routes in weeks 10 to 18 as Van Jefferson, who is the guy that people are targeting as sort of the wide receiver 2 here and the way to play late wide receiver, because Jefferson is going to get routes. You're probably going to get some targets. Jefferson has been a vertical player. You get some spike weeks. That's the way most people playing it. I'm not against that at all. I think that's a very viable approach. But Atwell averaged more yards per route. He had a 21% target per route rate over the second half of that season to only 16% for Van Jefferson. A huge advantage in weighted targets per route, which Connor O'Driscoll has a great article on the site about how that can help you find some players who are undervalued or some perfect sleepers. Even lacking the routes, he ends up with the same whopper as Jefferson over the second half of the season. So you look at this and you look at the price and you're talking about last round undrafted. He starts to get a little bit interesting. And I won't go through all of the stuff that we have in the article about what the coaches have said about him, but they are enthusiastic, number one, about his development, and number two, about his flexibility. Those are things that the Rams need. They need a guy to come through and be able to do multiple things in their offense. If Atwell can be that, even at 155 pounds, that starts to put him into a situation where you do actually have the locked-in volume. And, we don't necessarily feel the same way about the Rams offense as we did a year ago. I mean, you had that situation where Matthew Stafford comes in, Cooper Kupp goes supernova, LA wins the Super Bowl, and then everybody wants to overdraft the players the next season, including someone like an Allen Robinson. It's almost on a full 180 to where now these guys are a little bit toxic. Matthew Stafford is hurt. Sean McVay, not that he's not a genius, but it's like, I mean, how much can you really do if you don't have the players? And they don't have the players, and they don't have the offensive line. And yet you work through all of that. If we get a little bit of a tilting back in the direction of Stafford being healthy, Akers taking a little bit of a step forward, Kupp being out there and drawing coverage, the team gets a little bit more aggressive passing the ball again, there's an opportunity in the peripheral roles here. And I prefer, again, we talk about even the difference between round 14 and 15 and the final round when you need a name. I think that Atwell is an interesting breakout guy. Is he likely to break out? Obviously not, but he's someone who has been very good. You want to draft players who have proven themselves at a level and have interesting peripherals, not just a name. I like him here.
So we'll see if that will give a bump to his ADP over the next couple of weeks for people listening, and we'll see where the OT drafters start taking him, Shawn. But it is intriguing. You mentioned the name Allen Robinson there as well, and we thought that he was going much too high last year, but when you look at how this offense has been drafted this year, you mentioned the word toxic, and that feels like how drafters are looking at the Rams. And although they're not our favorite team to be drafting at the moment, it feels like it may have gone a couple of steps too far at this point. But that is our 5 names. That is getting us to the end of this episode. As we mentioned at the start, this is an article from Shawn that is up on RotoViz.com. If you want to get access to all of the content and tools up on the RotoViz.com website, you can use the code RVRadio2023 at checkout. That gives you access to everything that is available over there. Once again, that code is RVRadio2023. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out this and much more up on RotoViz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.